Hey everyone, tonight we're diving headfirst into the brutal, ridiculous, yet terrifyingly real universe of medieval duels. We're settling things like men literally meant gambling with your life over trivial matters like stolen poultry, spilled ale, or poorly delivered insults. Before you get comfortable, smash that like button if you're enjoying this content. And subscribe, but only if you genuinely dig what we're doing here. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I'm always fascinated to see our global audience tuning in. Now, dim those lights, maybe crank up a fan for some ambient background noise, and let's ease into tonight's wild journey together. Picture this. Your neighbor accuses you of swiping his prized cow. Maybe he claims you've insulted his honor, or, worse, questioned his noble ancestry. In medieval Europe, you basically had two options here. Option 1, talk it out like civilized adults.
Yeah, right.
Like that ever happened. Option 2, challenge the jerk to a duel. Now we're talking. This was trial by combat, the preferred legal method for resolving disputes in an era when paperwork was scarce but tempers ran hotter than a blacksmith's forge. The concept sounded noble in theory. Let two parties duke it out, and the winner must be telling the truth, because obviously God wouldn't let a liar win a sword fight. Spoiler alert, God tended to sit these ones out. The rules, and I use that term loosely, were vague at best. Some regions required matching weapons, swords, axes, or clubs, depending on your social status and how fancy the occasion was. Other places cared more about enthusiasm than standardization. Might show up in full plate armor while your opponent rocked nothing but a boiled leather vest in sheer optimism. Forget those cinematic duels. Top misty cliffs. The reality was usually some muddy field, town square, or whatever relatively flat patch of dirt allowed for maximum weapon swinging. Occasionally, you'd get spectators, not for fairness, but for entertainment value. And let me tell you, these fights weren't the graceful fencing matches you see in movies. Medieval duels were sweaty, awkward, exhausting affairs, two heavily armored dudes clanking around, wheezing through their visors, praying the other guy would face plant in the mud first. Here's an interesting twist. You didn't always have to kill your opponent. If they surrendered, maybe by yelling "uncle" or just groaning pathetically into the dirt, the duel could end right there. But if they didn't yield, well, let's just say the fight continued until someone stopped moving convincingly, and yes, there were documented cases of women dueling men, sometimes with handicap rules like making the man fight from a pit while the woman stood above with a club. Sounds bizarre. But hey, at least someone was trying to level the playing field. Literally. Let's rewind to early medieval times, when legal systems were more like gentle suggestions than actual frameworks. If someone accused you of pig theft, honor insults, or God forbid being secretly French, you didn't hire some fancy lawyer. You sharpened something pointy and asked God to pick sides. Thus was born the elegant institution of trial by combat, where truth wasn't determined by facts, but by who could swing a sword. Without immediately eating dirt, this started with Germanic tribes like the Franks, who believed their gods, and later, the Christian God would never let an innocent man lose a fight. You could lie, cheat, maybe have a few extra goats, but once steel came out, divine justice was supposed to intervene. Eventually, hopefully, unless God was on lunch break, trial by combat wasn't the only legal option available. There was also trial by fire. Carry this red-hot iron and pray your skin doesn't melt off, and trial by water if you float. You're guilty if you sink, you're innocent but probably dead. But trial by combat had style. It was dramatic, noisy, and gave you the comforting illusion that skill actually mattered. Over time, this became so popular it got written into actual law codes like the Lex Aliminorum and Lex Salica. Basically, the medieval equivalent of my uncle wrote this down, so it must be legal. These spelled out that if someone called you a liar and you were feeling spicy, you could challenge them to duel. Just bring your own weapons and try not to embarrass your ancestors. By the 12th century, trial by combat had wormed its way into feudal courts. Nobles used it to settle land disputes, marital accusations, and anything else needing a dramatic resolution. There were, or let's call them guidelines. Duels needed judicial approval, meaning some robed official had to say, yes, you may now attempt to legally bludgeon each other. The kicker. If you refused to fight, you were automatically guilty. Your choices were pick up a weapon and pray for divine assistance, or go straight to jail, or worse, back to peasant life. Imagine a knight. Majestic armor, flowing plume, eyes burning with valor. Now imagine that same knight gasping for air as he wrestles another grown man in a mud puddle while his squire holds the horses and tries not to develop PTSD. Welcome to Knightly Duels, where honor was at stake, but coordination was optional. Duels. Between knights were supposed to be refined affairs, governed by chivalry's code, fighting with courage, fairness, and restraint. But once those helmets went on and visibility dropped to 0, out. Most of that went out the window faster than an angry cat. Suddenly you've got 2 armored tanks engaged in the world's loudest, clunkiest slap fight. Before the match, both parties would air their grievances, ranging from "you insulted my noble house" to "your dog looked at me funny." Judges or nobles would oversee things, pretending this was dignified rather than professional grudge, settling in metal pajamas. Weapons were agreed upon, usually long swords, maces, or lances, though sometimes they'd just grab whatever was handy. Occasionally, combatants would switch weapons mid-fight, usually because they dropped their first choice and panicked. Armor got specialized for dueling extra plating, around vital areas: head, chest, ego, maybe some spikes for flair. Mobility suffered, though. Watching 2 knights duel was like watching 2 overstuffed wardrobes tumble down a staircase. Loud, slow, and full of unexpected injuries. Contrary to romantic paintings, most duels didn't end with some noble death blow. They ended when one knight collapsed from exhaustion or got pinned down and politely bludgeoned into submission. Sometimes a guy would scream, "I yield," through a mouthful of helmet, assuming anyone could hear him over all the wheezing and metal clanging. Killing your opponent wasn't always necessary or even encouraged, especially if the duel started over something stupid like a misheard insult or a lost glove. Nobody wanted to explain to the king why Sir Geoffrey was now fertilizer. Not every duel involved nobles in shiny armor. Sometimes justice needed serving between 2 peasants arguing over serious matters like whose turn it was with the village plow, or who spilled whose beer 3 market days ago. When you're a medieval peasant, your conflict resolution options were 1. Yell, 2. Throw something, or 3. Duel with whatever's nearby and vaguely sharp. Welcome to peasant duels. Same rage, smaller budget. Unlike knights, peasants couldn't afford custom armor or fancy weapons. Most duels happened in fields, alleyways, or behind the tavern, places already decorated with mud, animal droppings, and the occasional passed-out witness. This wasn't about spectacle, it was about pride. And maybe a chicken? The weapons? Utterly creative. Pitchforks, hoes, sticks, kitchen knives, heavy rocks, even soup ladles. If you could lift and swing it with emotion, it qualified. Some fights reportedly ended with someone getting brained by a wheel of cheese. That's not legend, that's just Tuesday. There were rarely formal rules. Most fights started spontaneously and ended when someone gave up, passed out, or wandered off from sheer boredom. Occasionally a village elder or drunk uncle would referee, a role that mostly involved shouting, "All right, lads, that's enough," while chewing on an apple. Despite the chaos, these brawls weren't always frowned upon. Some communities saw a good, clean fight as therapeutic, like medieval therapy. Except, instead of talking about feelings, you tried to dislocate someone's shoulder with a shovel. Occasionally, someone did get seriously hurt or die, usually from head trauma or sheer embarrassment. That's when local authorities would step in to remind everyone that killing was generally frowned upon, unless a noble or god had given the thumbs up. When it came to medieval dueling, your weapon of choice spoke volumes about who you were, told your opponent how serious you were, how deep your pockets ran, and in some cases, what you'd been interrupted doing before the fight. Let's break down the medieval arsenal that turned ordinary disputes into blood sport. The longsword was the knightly go-to, elegant, balanced, and capable of settling arguments with a single well-placed thrust. Showing up with one basically screamed, "I've trained for this and probably own land." Then there was the mace, medieval Europe's answer to the sledgehammer. No finesse. Just pure bludgeoning power designed to crush through armor like a walnut. The mace didn't bother with subtlety. It was the weapon equivalent of bringing a wrecking ball to a fencing match. Axes had their own rugged charm, especially among fighters who liked a lumberjack aesthetic. Some were single-handed for versatility, others double-handed for maximum dramatic effect. Nothing says this is personal, quite like swinging what was essentially a glorified firewood tool at someone's helmet. The message was clear. I'm not just here to win. I'm here to split you like a log. Now for the more creative choices. Peasants, lacking access to proper weapons, turned everyday objects into instruments of mayhem. Pitchforks became three-pronged. Spears, sticks, transformed into makeshift clubs. And in one documented case, a frying pan served as an impromptu mace. There's actual historical record of someone showing up to a duel armed with kitchenware. One guy apparently wielded a cast iron skillet with such conviction that the local priest made a special note about it in the parish records, probably under unusual blunt force trauma. Daggers were the close quarters specialists, some sleek and deadly, others basically pointy triangles of metal. In tight spaces like castle corridors or tavern basements, daggers let you settle scores without knocking over too many chairs. You really wanted to make a statement? You might roll up with a flail, that infamous ball and chain, contraption that looked terrifying but was nearly impossible to aim properly. There's a reason you don't see flail experts today. Most medieval practitioners probably knocked themselves unconscious mid-swing. The medieval church. That bastion of peace and moral guidance found itself in a theological pickle when it came to dueling. In theory, they condemned violence. In practice, let's just say their position was more it depends than absolutely not. Trial by combat actually started with holy justification, the belief that God would ensure the righteous. Party prevailed. After all, what better way to determine truth than seeing who could swing harder without falling over? Priests would bless combatants before fights, not to stop them, to make sure God had his paperwork in order. Church officials often presided over formal duels, especially those sanctioned by courts. One monk was known to keep score, not officially. Mind you, just because he found it interesting? The logic was simple. If a man survived, God must have favored him. If he didn't, well, divine judgment had spoken. And hey, at least there was now an opening in the church choir. Not everyone in the church was on board, though. Its various popes periodically banned trial by combat, calling it barbaric, unchristian, and terrible for Sunday attendance. These bans were widely ignored, especially by nobles who had a knack for only hearing church decrees when they agreed with them. Ironically, monasteries weren't exactly violence-free zones either. Records show monks brawling over garden tools overdue. Library books and choir assignments. One particularly heated argument ended with a novice monk hurling a psalm book at someone's head, divine inspiration weaponized. The church's real issue with dueling wasn't the violence itself, it was the unpredictability. Sometimes the wrong person won, and nothing undermines divine authority like God apparently favoring the guy who smelled like ale and hadn't confessed in 6 years. As legal systems matured, and as people kept bleeding on church property, clergy began pushing for witness testimony over trial by combat. But in the meantime, the church kept a careful distance, close enough to bless the fights, far enough to avoid accidental stabbings. Because while forgiveness was eternal, bruises were definitely immediate. If you thought medieval dueling was an all-boys club, think again. Women occasionally stepped into the ring or mud pit or cabbage field. And when they did, things got gloriously complicated. Medieval society had very specific ideas about women, delicate, modest, and definitely not supposed to be giving people concussions in public. But every so often, a woman had simply had enough. And the results were duels that left both participants bruised and spectators deeply confused. The most famous example comes from 14th century Germany, where local law actually permitted women, to challenge men to duels under one bizarre condition. The man had to stand, waist deep in a hole with one arm tied behind his back, while the woman stood on solid ground armed with a club. He got one too, presumably to maintain some semblance of fairness, though the whole arrangement felt more like a carnival game than legal proceedings. And yet, this actually happened more than once. Picture the scene: a man half buried like a confused turnip, spinning slowly with his club while a woman takes careful, measured swings from above, occasionally pausing to adjust her apron. One German woodcut even depicts a woman knocking a man flat while onlookers cheer in what can only be described as passive-aggressive amazement. These duels were rare but legal. Women could also appoint champions to fight for them, usually brothers, or cousins, or anyone they hadn't annoyed recently. But if a woman chose to fight herself, that was taken seriously. No interference allowed. Lose, and you were guilty and humiliated. Win, and you'd just rearrange someone's shoulder with a stick. Of course, dueling wasn't the only outlet for female rage. Feuds between women often played out in less organized ways: poisonings, whispered accusations of witchcraft, the occasional shoe thrown at market. But these sanctioned duels represented a fascinating legal acknowledgement that women had a right to defend their honor physically. These moments were awkward for medieval society. Women weren't supposed to be violent or victorious. And yet, there they were, club in hand, proving that sometimes the best defense was a good offense. Just when you thought medieval dueling couldn't get more absurd, someone put a pig on trial. Yes, really. In a legal system held together by Latin, wishful thinking, and divine assumption, animals were sometimes treated as legal persons, meaning they could be accused of crimes, punished, and in some cases challenged to duels. Most animal duels were really just executions with paperwork, but occasionally things got properly weird in 15th century France. One particularly surreal case involved a man dueling a dog. The dog had allegedly attacked its master before fleeing to a monastery for sanctuary, apparently an option for canines in medieval law. The duel happened in a public arena. The man in full armor, the dog in, well, fur. The dog won. The crowd went wild. And no, we don't know how the man explained that to his descendants. Trained war animals sometimes entered the fray too: horses, mastiffs, even the occasional bear pitted against criminals in mock combat displays. These weren't proper trials, but they were public, violent, and someone always lost, usually the guy not covered in fur and teeth. Why all this? Because in the medieval mind, the world was a carefully balanced moral order. If people could sin, so could pigs. If men could stand trial, why not goats? And if justice involved violence, then anything with limbs was fair game. Was this justice? Not really. Was it symbolic, apparently? Is it weird? Absolutely. Its cases are documented in court records and medieval manuscripts, complete with serious theological debates. Somewhere, a monk once had to determine whether a donkey was acting under demonic influence or just having an off day. Jousting. The medieval equivalent of dueling on horseback was arguably the most theatrical way to settle disputes. Part sport, part ritual, part I hope this helmet fits. Jousting operated on the bizarre premise that two men charging at each other with lances would somehow reveal cosmic truth. Mostly it revealed who could stay in the saddle longer. Jousting was knightly territory. You needed a horse, armor, squires, and the kind of financial stability that lets you risk spinal injury for fun. The setup was simple. Two knights charged from opposite ends of a tilt barrier, trying to knock each other off with long wooden lances. Points for clean hits, extra points for dramatic splintering. This took in a bonus humiliation if you fell off like a sack of potatoes. Despite the pageantry, people got hurt, concussions, broken bones, the occasional impalement. One knight took a lance, tipped through his eye into his brain, but rode another 100 feet before collapsing. Because medieval dignity demanded you finish your pass before dying. There were rules, lots of them, about where you could aim with killing. Discouraged, but not entirely forbidden depending on the audience. Your horse had to be trained, armored, preferably not in a bad mood. Some jousts were genuine legal proceedings, especially among nobles settling land disputes or marital issues. Think courtroom drama, but with more screaming and manure. Of course, not everyone was graceful. Horses panicked. Riders dropped lances, and occasionally someone forgot to lower their visor and got a face full of splinters. The spectacle might have looked noble, but most jousts ended with someone being carried off by worried squires and one very judgmental stable boy. Between law, blood sport, and accidental comedy, dueling quietly became one of medieval Europe's favorite pastimes. By the 13th century, duels weren't just disputes, they were events. Villagers gathered, nobles invited guests, merchants sold snacks, roasted turnips, anyone, and there was sometimes even music. It was less about justice and more about medieval fight night. Dueling drew all classes, peasants standing in mud, lords in velvet trying not to look too excited, clergymen placing discreet bets because God works in mysterious ways, especially when favorable odds are involved. Temporary stands went up, beer flowed, bread flew sometimes at the fighters, and when combat started, the crowd hung on every swing, grunt, and misstep. A clean hit brought cheers, a dramatic fall got gasps. Losing a finger guaranteed tavern stories for years. The entertainment wasn't just violence, it was the characters. Some duelists became local celebrities, the bold young squire, the grizzled veteran, the guy who once lost to a goose. People came for the drama and the chance to witness someone tripping over their own sword. Occasionally fights were so boring the crowd turned on both fighters, hurling produce if in season. One chronicler described a duel where both men refused to engage for 20 minutes, resulting in spectators declaring a nearby sheep the moral victor. Over time, dueling became less about truth and more about spectacle. It proved justice didn't need efficiency, just noise, mess, and preferably some shirtless combat. Because if you're going to settle legal matters, why not invite the whole town and make a day of it? Not all medieval duels were tavern brawls over stolen buckets. Some became legendary showdowns that didn't just leave bruises. They reshaped history, or at least gave everyone something dramatic to gossip about for generations. Let's spotlight a few of history's most consequential clashes where steel decided more than just personal honor. The 1386 duel between Jean de Carouge and Jacques Legris stands as arguably the most famous trial by combat in French history. Carouge accused Legris of an unforgivable crime violating his wife Marguerite. When courts couldn't untangle the truth, they resorted to the medieval equivalent of let them fight. King Charles VI himself attended, along with thousands of spectators hungry for drama. The two men mounted horses, lowered lances, and charged. Armor dented, lances shattered, and ultimately, Carouge emerged victorious by killing Legris, which legally proved his wife's testimony true. Because apparently divine justice works on a last man standing basis. The event was so monumental, it inspired books and films centuries later. Not to mention making French lawmakers quietly reconsider whether maybe trial by combat wasn't the brightest legal innovation. Then there's the 1467 duel between Burgundian champion Jacques de Lolong and a Spanish knight, a clash arranged for diplomacy, glory, and good old-fashioned national pride. They fought for hours with various weapons before calling it a draw medieval code for we're too exhausted. To keep pretending this is fun, lesser known but equally bizarre, was the duel between two monks over who should direct the church choir, proving even men of God weren't above settling musical differences via blunt force trauma. Another pair of nobles famously dueled because one sneezed during the other's toast because nothing says bless you like a sword to the gut. These duels, whether world-changing or ridiculously petty, all operated on the same medieval logic. When words fail and evidence is lacking, strap on armor, grab the nearest pointy object, and hope your opponent skipped breakfast. Because in the Middle Ages, the line between justice and justifiable homicide was often as thin as a dagger's edge. In medieval society, words carried nuclear-level consequences. What might today earn you an angry tweet could literally get you stabbed in the 14th century. Insults weren't just rude, they were legally actionable offenses, that could end with someone's collarbone in pieces. Calling someone a liar, thief, or heaven forbid a coward wasn't just trash talk. It was potential grounds for a duel where your sword would do the final editing on your argument. But medieval insults were an art form, requiring specific flourishes. This was an era where people spent 10 minutes saying good morning, so naturally they put equal effort into creative defamation. Some preferred direct attacks. You're a knave and scoundrel, unworthy of your title and your trousers. Others went poetic. You're the spawn of a flea-bitten sow, lower than the worms beneath the dung heap. Extra syllables meant extra burn. Nobles elevated insults slinging to high art, exchanging passive-aggressive letters in elaborate calligraphy that basically said your mother was a hamster with fancier penmanship. If things escalated, and they always did, formal challenges were issued, sometimes in writing, sometimes by dramatically throwing down a glove or overturning a goblet. One particularly creative gentleman slapped his rival with a fish, which sounds hilarious until you remember medieval fish probably still had teeth. Refusing to respond to an insult was often worse than the insult itself. It marked you as dishonorable, weak, or worst of all, boring. Reputation was everything in the medieval world. Single well-delivered insult could ruin families, start duels, or ignite feuds lasting generations. It was dangerous territory where flowery language met very real. Consequences of verbal minefield, where the wrong phrase could get you killed with legal approval, so you've insulted someone's ancestry, spilled their wine, or looked at their livestock with suspicious appreciation. Now you're standing in a muddy field, clutching a sword you barely remember how to hold, wondering how your life led to this moment. Welcome to Dueling 101 Medieval Edition. Let's talk strategy. Step 1. Show up. Sounds obvious, but skipping. A duel made you automatically guilty by medieval law. You'd lose honor, reputation, and possibly body parts, depending on local sentencing trends. Unless you fancied public shaming and/or ear removal, attendance was mandatory. Step 2. Size up your opponent. Are they armored like a walking fortress, sweating through their visor, quietly reciting what sounds suspiciously like last rites? Good, you're either doomed or about to become legendary. Step 3. Know your weapons. Longsword. Aim for joints. Mace. Swing until something cracks. Daggers. Congratulations. You're now in the world's most awkward wrestling match. Step 4. Psychological warfare works. Random shouting could be surprisingly effective. One knight reportedly screamed turnips before charging, causing his opponent to hesitate just long enough to eat dirt. Confidence mattered. So did confusion. Step 5. Don't trip. Easier said than done when you're wearing 50 pounds of metal standing in mud made of equal parts rainwater and regret. Face planting in the first 30 seconds guaranteed your name would live on as a cautionary tale in tavern ballads. Final tip: if you're going to lose, lose memorably. Go down swinging with flair. Shout something dramatic. Make your defeat so spectacular they'll sing about it for years. One guy threw his sword while yelling to the moon with you. It didn't help him win, but children made up rhymes about it for weeks. Because while victory earns you honor, spectacular failure earns you immortality, or at least a good drinking story. At its core, dueling wasn't just about winning. It was about pride, performance, and giving the audience something better too. Disgust than the plague, or that year's failed harvest. Because in the Middle Ages, if you couldn't be undefeated, you could at least be unforgettable. Behind all the talk of honor and justice lurked dueling's dark secrets. Sometimes it was just state-sanctioned murder with better costumes. Let's say you're a noble with a problematic rival, too rich, too loud, his falconry skills embarrassingly superior. You can't just stab him, that's uncivilized, but if you provoke him into a duel, suddenly homicide comes with legal approval and a side of pageantry. The playbook was simple. Insult his wife's embroidery, accuse him of watering down his wine, push until he challenges you, or vice versa. Either way, someone's not walking away. And it's all perfectly legal because you followed protocol witnesses, formal challenge, maybe some Latin phrases about honor. You could beat a man to death in public, and everyone would nod solemnly about. divine justice. This system was especially handy for removing inconvenient people with plausible deniability. Rival claimant to your land? Duel political opponent gaining favor? Duel that baron asking uncomfortable questions about missing tax money? Definitely duel. Win, and your innocent +1 horse? Lose, and well, at least you tried. Some duelists took it further by hiring professional champions, basically outsourcing your honor to someone with better biceps. If the hired muscle killed your opponent quickly and dramatically, even better, less mess, more applause. Of course, the key was making it look official: robes, oaths, pre-fight prayers. That way, when someone's head rolled, everyone could agree it was tragic but righteous. Not just Tuesday with extra bloodstains, because in the Middle Ages, murder was illegal unless you called it a duel and added enough ceremony to make it smell. Like justice, like plague cures and fashion choices involving pointy shoes, dueling eventually fell out of favor. By the late medieval period, society began developing slightly less ridiculous ways to resolve conflicts. Things like evidence in courts, and not settling arguments by hitting each other with farm tools in front of a priest. Several factors killed the duel. Rising centralized governments disliked private citizens solving disputes via swordplay. To messy, to public, and occasionally someone important lost awkward. The church finally enforced centuries of vague disapproval with actual consequences, like excommunication, basically getting blocked by God. There were also practical issues. Dueling required time, equipment, horses, armor, and an audience willing to stand around watching two men bleed into a turnip patch. Not exactly efficient when judges realized they could just ask questions and examine documents instead. By the 16th century, dueling had evolved into a gentleman's pastime: less mud, more fashion, pistols replacing swords. Rules became elaborate, outfits more ridiculous looking at you, ruffled collars. While still a great way to get dramatically killed, at least you could do it in tights with excellent posture. Eventually, even this faded laws changed. Public opinion shifted, and dueling became that weird thing your great-uncle did once after too much wine. Today, trial by combat survives only in historical reenactments, obscure legal debates, and that. One guy at the pub insisting it's still technically legal in Wales. The medieval duel died as it lived loudly, dramatically, and somewhat confused about what it was actually accomplishing. Its legacy? A reminder that humanity's search for justice has taken some spectacularly weird detours before reaching anything resembling fairness. In the medieval countryside, where doctors were rarer than honest tax collectors, the peasant healer stood as the first and often only line of defense against illness. These healers, usually women rooted deep in their communities, practiced an art passed down through generations. It's untrained by formal standards, but armed with centuries of accumulated wisdom. They served as the village's walking pharmacy, therapist, and sometimes even exorcist. Their workshops would make modern herbalists weep with envy. Bundles of drying herbs hung from rafters, shelves overflowed with jars of crushed bark and animal fats, while the hearth smoke preserved medicinal ingredients. A healer might prepare comfrey compresses to reduce swelling or boil willow bark to ease pain centuries before scientists isolated salicin, nature's aspirin, from its fibers. Every remedy blended experimentation with ancestral knowledge. Where Trilander met hard-won tradition, but peasant healing wasn't just about plants. It was deeply spiritual. Illness wasn't merely physical. It could stem from sin, curses, or malevolent spirits. Healers recited blessings while applying poultices, whispered charms as they bound wounds. Their craft addressed both body and soul, treating the person's pain and spiritual unrest simultaneously. This holistic approach made them indispensable. They delivered babies, set bones, soothed fevers, and comforted the dying when no other options existed. Yet these women walked a dangerous line. Respected today could mean feared tomorrow. Harvests failed or children died unexpectedly, the community's gratitude could curdle into suspicion. A healer who cured with herbs might suddenly be accused of witchcraft if her remedies failed, or if she behaved oddly. Many so-called witches in historical records were simply healers who'd fallen out of favor for all the risks. The peasant healer remained the village's lifeline. In an era when a simple infection could be fatal, her knowledge offered precious hope. Modern science has since confirmed many traditional remedies contained genuinely effective compounds. But beyond any physical healing, these women provided something equally vital: the reassurance that someone cared enough to try. When logic failed and prayers went unanswered, medieval peasants turned to witch bottles, bizarre yet widespread protections against supernatural illness. These small containers, usually glass or stoneware, held peculiar ingredients meant to trap or repel harmful magic. The contents read like a witch's shopping list: iron nails, the victim's hair or nail, clippings, red thread, pins, herbs, and urine. Yes, urine. The logic would lure the witch responsible, while the sharp objects inside would wound her spirit. Preparation rituals mattered. After filling, the bottle was buried upside down near doorways, under hearths, or below thresholds anywhere evil might enter. If illness persisted, the bottle might be dug up and recharged with stronger ingredients. Archaeologists have found hundreds across Europe, many still sealed after centuries, silent witnesses to very real fears. Parallel practices included apotropaic, marks mystical symbols carved into door frames, invoking protection, circles, pentagrams. Or the letters V for Virgin Mary served as spiritual alarm systems. These weren't decorations, but desperate safeguards in a world where illness and misfortune needed both physical and supernatural defenses. For medieval peasants, sickness wasn't just bad luck, it was potential spiritual warfare. Their solutions might seem strange today, but reflected a worldview where protection required guarding both body and soul. When survival hung by a thread, people used whatever threads they had, even if that meant burying jars of fingernails in pee. Medieval peasants didn't see nature as separate. It was their pharmacy, grocery, and hardware store combined. When illness struck, they turned to fields and forests where generations had cataloged which plants healed and which harmed. This wasn't hobby gardening. It was life-or-death botany. Common finds in a healer's satchel included yarrow, the medieval band-aid, known to stop bleeding; chamomile for upset stomachs and sleepless nights; mugwort, burned to ward off illness; or brood for aching joints; stinging nettle, ironically used to relieve pain after carefully removing the stinger's timing, was everything. Plants were harvested under specific moon phases, after morning dew evaporated, or before solstices. Beliefs that potency changed with celestial rhythms. Preparation blended practicality and ritual. A healer might chant while crushing leaves or bless the water used in teas. The act of making medicine was as important as ingredients themselves. Knowledge passed orally, mother to daughter, healer to apprentice. Families guarded secret recipes like treasure. One might know how to distinguish edible mushrooms from deadly ones. Another, which root worked best, boiled versus dried. This was science without laboratories, chemistry without textbooks, and intuitive understanding of nature's pharmacy forged through observation and survival necessity. Modern research has confirmed many traditional remedies contained genuine active compounds. Willow bark really does reduce pain. We now synthesize it as aspirin. Honey, a common medieval wound dressing, has antibacterial properties. These weren't just folk tales, but the result of centuries of careful experimentation where mistakes could be fatal. Herbalism represented humanity's first clinical trials conducted in forest clearings rather than sterile labs. For peasants living one bad harvest from starvation, a basket of properly gathered herbs could mean the difference between recovery and joining the churchyard's silent majority. Their knowledge wasn't quaint, was literally life-saving. Beyond herbs, medieval medicine ventured into ... creative territory. Some remedies relied on the cures, like principle using animals, believed to draw out disease. Frogs and toads featured prominently in treatments that sound like bad fantasy novels. A live frog might be pressed against a sore throat or infected wound, then released into a stream, theoretically carrying the illness away. More extreme versions involved cutting open frogs and applying them directly to ailments. Toad powder, exactly what it sounds like, made its way into salves and wound treatments. The logic: if illness came from something unnatural, only an equally magical creature could combat it. Other animal-based treatments included spider webs used to bind wounds. Modern science confirms the silk contains vitamin K, aiding clotting mice boiled and milk-fed to children with persistent coughs. Snakeskins worn as talismans against fever. Animals also served as living diagnostic tools. A dog avoiding someone's bed or a cat hissing at a particular child might signal impending death. Birds tapping windows could mean recovery, or divine warnings. In a world without x-rays or lab tests, peasants trusted nature's signs, however. Peculiar they seem today, these practices weren't random, but stemmed from a worldview, where disease was external, something that could be transferred, repelled, or tricked into leaving. When survival hung in the balance, even the strangest cure was worth trying. Somewhere in history, there's probably a peasant who swore their life was saved by a toad wearing a tiny hat tanned given medieval mortality rates. Who's to say they were wrong? Medieval peasants saw the sky as more than just weather. It was a celestial clock governing health. The moon's phases dictated treatment timing in ways that blended astronomy, superstition, and careful observation. A waxing moon growing fuller meant strength and regeneration, ideal for taking fortifying medicines. A waning moon fading signaled purification, best for bloodletting or purging illness. This lunar logic extended to haircuts, surgeries, even nail trimming. Do it under the wrong phase and risk bad luck or slow healing. Beyond the moon, basic astrology crept into healing. While full horoscopes were for elites, peasants knew planetary influences. Mars ascending is bad for bloodletting. Its fiery nature might overheat the blood. Venus ruling, excellent for moisture-related treatments. The zodiac mana, popular medieval diagram, showed body parts governed by star signs: Aries head, Taurus neck, etc. Healers used this to time treatments, like waiting until the moon was in Libra before treating back pain. This wasn't mere superstition, but an attempt to find order in chaos. Before germ theory, people linked health to cosmic patterns. The sky offered a predictable map in an unpredictable world, a calendar for survival when even minor illnesses could be fatal. While we now know better, their meticulous tracking of celestial rhythms represented real science in its infancy, humanity's first steps toward understanding our place in nature's grand system. For all their herbal brews and animal cures, medieval peasants ultimately turned to higher powers when illness struck. Saints' relics became the medieval equivalent of emergency rooms, places where the desperately ill-sought miracles when earthly remedies failed. Churches and monasteries housed these sacred objects: bone fragments, clothing scraps, even coffin splinters believed to carry divine healing power. Pilgrims traveled days to shrines like St. Thomas Becket's. His blood supposedly cured blindness, or St. Catherine's, a finger bone brought fertility. Simply touching these items, or sometimes just being near them, offered hope of recovery. Local parishes provided smaller-scale access: a drop of oil from a saint's lamp, cloth that had touched a relic. Priests would bless the sick with these objects, or place them on afflicted body parts during prayer. The relics themselves weren't magical. Their power came from association with holiness. Specific saints specialized like medieval medical specialists. Saint Apollona toothaches, Saint Rock plague protection, Saint Blaze throat ailments, for those too ill to travel. Healers might write saints' names on parchment to wear as charms. Lighting candles before saint statues or leaving offerings at roadside shrines were common practices. Medieval healthcare plans with celestial deductibles. The church tolerated these practices when focused on approved saints, but cracked down on anything smelling of pagan roots. A fine line existed between pious veneration and forbidden magic, one that peasant healers navigated carefully. Too much enthusiasm for a particular spring or stone risked witchcraft accusations. Yet for all the theological debates, relics offered something pure and simple to suffering peasants' hope. When medicine failed and death loomed, faith provided comfort that someone, somewhere, was listening. In an uncertain world, that certainty alone could be its own kind of healing. All right, let's talk about the medieval medics, plague doctors. These guys look like something out of a nightmare with those creepy bird masks, but they were actually trying to help. Bless their hearts. Picture this. You're coughing up blood. During the Black Death, and in walks a dude dressed like a demonic pelican. Not exactly comforting, but hey, desperate times, right? Those infamous beaky masks. Total 17th century invention, not medieval like everyone thinks. By the time doctors started rocking this look, the worst plague outbreaks were already over. Talk about fashionably late to the party. The whole get-up, leather cloak, goggles, hat, and that ridiculous half-meter beak was basically medieval. Hazmat gear. And get this. The beak wasn't just for looks. They stuffed it with herbs like lavender and cloves because everyone thought bad smells caused disease. Imagine walking around with your nose in a potpourri pouch 24/7. No wonder these guys were always cranky. The outfit was designed by some French royal doctor who clearly had drama queen tendencies. We're talking full waxed coat like your grandpa's fishing jacket, but deadlier. Leather gloves, boots, and this walking stick they'd use to poke patients from a safe distance. The whole ensemble screamed, "I'm not touching you," which was pretty smart when you think about it. These docs weren't stupid. They knew whatever caused plague was catching, even if they blamed it on bad air instead of bacteria. Now here's the messed up part. Most plague doctors weren't even proper physicians. They were usually young trainees, foreign docs, or just random dudes willing to risk death for steady pay. The job description read like a horror movie script. Go into infected homes. Check pulses with the stick, obviously record deaths, and occasionally do autopsies. And try not to die yourself. No pressure. Their treatments? Yeah, about that. We're talking bloodletting, because losing blood totally helps when you're already weak. Herbal potions, and my personal favorite, rubbing onions or chopped up snakes on the boils. Sometimes they'd strap live chickens to plague sores, which sounds like a bad joke, but I swear they actually did this. The logic was the disease would jump to the animal instead. Spoiler, it didn't work. The wildest part? These docs became walking omens of death. Seeing one approach your house was basically the medieval equivalent of getting a terminal diagnosis. Towns paid them to stick around, though, because having someone deal with plague victims was better than nothing. Talk about a thankless job. You either died from the plague or got lynched by terrified villagers. There's no winning here. But give them some credit. Plague doctors were the first to establish real quarantine rules. They'd mark infected houses with big red crosses, very original, enforce travel bans, and even set up early isolation wards. Some smart ones started keeping records of infections, basically inventing epidemiology before anyone knew what germs were. Not bad for guys dressed like steampunk vultures. Here's the irony. Their fancy costumes probably did help. It's just not how they thought. All those layers, great at blocking flea bites, the actual plague carriers, the herbs in the beak, might have repelled some bacteria. Even staying at arm's length with that stick was smart infection control. They got lucky by accident while following totally wrong science. Classic medieval medicine. The masks eventually became symbols of terror rather than healing. Later generations turned them into carnival costumes and horror movie villains, which seems kind of rude when you think about what these guys went through. Modern doctors get scrubs and stethoscopes. These dudes got leather trench coats and death stares. But hey, at least they're immortalized in memes now. Speaking of messed up medieval medicine, let's chat about childbirth. If you think having a baby today is rough, try doing it in the 1300s. No pain meds. No sterilization. Just your village midwife and a whole lot of praying. Maternal mortality rates were so high, they'd have women write their wills before going into labor. Cheery, right? Midwives were the real MVPs here. Experienced women who'd seen it all. Their toolkit included herbs to ease pain, willow bark tea basically, special birthing stools, and prayers to St. Margaret, patron saint of childbirth, because apparently heaven had specialists. Some sneaky tricks too, they'd tie ribbons around the mother's belly that were blessed by the local priest. Placebo effect, maybe comforting. Definitely, here's where it gets wild if things went south. Midwives would perform emergency baptisms with whatever liquid was handy. We're talking about women who could deliver a breech baby by candlelight but needed permission from the church to splash some water on a dying newborn. The paperwork must have been ridiculous. And get this, men weren't allowed at births at all. Doctors would literally give instructions from behind a curtain if things got complicated. Imagine some pompous physician yelling, "Have you tried pushing?" through a bedsheet while your wife screams. It's medieval feminism at its finest. Babies didn't have it much better. Swaddling was so tight it looked like baby straitjackets. They believed this would make limbs grow straight. Never mind at the poor. Kid couldn't move for months. Cradle boards got strapped to mothers like medieval baby bjorns, which was practical until someone forgot and yeeted the baby into a haystack. About 1 in 5 kids never made it to their first birthday. Those who survived got weaned onto bread-soaked in ale. Parenting was different back then. People would even rub whiskey on teething gums. Medieval babies were probably the most relaxed demographic in the village. Now let's talk surgery, or as they called it. Let's hack at this until you pass out from pain. Anesthesia?
8.
Give you some herbal concoction, or just have you chug wine until you stop screaming. The most advanced option was a good whack to the head with a mallet. Modern medicine is spoiled, I tell ya. Barber surgeons doubled as your haircut and amputation provider convenient. Their tools look like something from a torture museum: rusty saws, giant needles, and these horrifying pliers for pulling teeth. Infection was basically guaranteed. But hey, at least you'd look fresh for your funeral. Some of their cures sound like bad fan fiction. Got a headache? Let's drill holes in your skull to let the evil spirits out. Trepanation was shockingly common. Bad humors? Time for leeches or a good bleeding. The logic was literally, let's drain the bad stuff out, like you're changing car oil. The wildest part. Some of this actually worked, sort of. Herbal poultices did have antibacterial properties. They didn't understand. Setting bones properly could lead to full recovery. Even those crazy head drilling operations sometimes helped with swelling. They were working with about 5% of the knowledge we have today and still managed. It's not to kill everyone. Respect medical schools existed, but good luck getting in. You'd need Latin fluency, money, and the patience to sit through lectures based on 1,000-year-old Greek texts they refused to update. Dissection was illegal in many places, so students learned anatomy from, wait for it, ... drawings of pigs. Because obviously human bodies work exactly like swine. What could go wrong? The church blocked a lot of progress too. It's autopsies, only if we say so. Challenging Galen's ancient theories, heresy. Some poor guy figured out blood circulates centuries before anyone else, but got ignored because his ideas didn't fit church-approved science. Classic medieval bureaucracy. Hospitals weren't much better. More like hospices run by monks where you went to die spiritually clean. Actual treatment? Maybe some broth and prayers if you were lucky. The do no harm idea hadn't caught on yet, so you'd get all sorts of wacky experiments on the poor and desperate. But here's the thing. Medieval folks weren't dumb. They worked with what they had. When the Black Death hit, they noticed quarantine. Worked even if they didn't know why. Herbal remedies got passed down because they actually helped sometimes. Midwives developed legit skills through generations of trial and error. It's easy to laugh at their leeches and plague masks. But these people were fighting an invisible enemy with both hands tied behind their backs. They didn't have microscopes or germ theory, just observation, tradition, and sheer stubborn will to survive. And honestly, that deserves some respect. Sure, their methods seem crazy now, but in 500 years, who's to say our modern medicine won't look just as ridiculous? Alright, let's chat about medieval mental health, or as they called it, why is that guy talking to a tree again? The Middle Ages didn't exactly have therapy couches, but they had some. Creative approaches to what we'd now call mental illness. Buckle up, because this gets weird fast. First off, forget depression or anxiety diagnoses. Back then, if you were acting strange, you were either possessed, cursed, or just plain touched by God. No in between. The village priest might try exorcism first. Holy water, prayers, the whole 9 yards. If that didn't work, congrats. You're now the local holy fool or witch. Depending on how entertaining your rants were, sleep deprivation was a popular cure. They'd keep melancholic patients awake for days, believing it would reset their brains. Imagine being sad, so some monk slaps you with a wet towel every time you blink. Shock therapy. Medieval style. Other treatments included herbal sedatives, basically medieval Xanax bleeding to balance moods, because nothing cheers you up like anemia, locking people in fools' chairs, basically timeout for adults violent. Patients might get chained in church basements or thrown in actual dungeons. The luckier ones ended up at places like Bethlehem Hospital in London, where we get the word bedlam from. It wasn't all bad, though. Some villages tolerated eccentric behavior as long as you pulled your weight. That odd lady talking to her chickens. She makes great cheese, so leave her be. Now let's talk hospitals. And I use that term loosely. Medieval. Hospitals were more like hostels run by monks, where you went to die in peace. Actual medical treatment. Maybe some broth and prayers if the nurses liked you. The wealthy could pay for private physicians who'd still probably just bleed you, while peasants relied on traveling barber surgeons, part doctor, part hairdresser, all terrifying wise women with their herb gardens. The local blacksmith, for when you needed that arrowhead removed ASAP surgery, was basically butchery with extra screaming.
No anesthesia beyond bite this leather strap or getting drunk.
Enough to not care. Surgeons used the same tools for amputations they'd used to debone fish that morning. Infection was pretty much guaranteed, but hey, if you survived the shock and sepsis, you got a badass scar to impress the ladies. Dentistry. Don't even get me started. Toothaches were blamed on worms in the teeth. Not totally wrong, just misunderstood. Treatments included praying to Saint Apollonia, patron saint of tooth pain, packing cavities with garlic AO, having the barber yank it out with pliers double AO, literally smoking the patient out like a beehive. What, the rich could afford fancy tooth powders made from crushed bones because delicious, while peasants just chewed mint leaves. Surprisingly, some skeletons showed decent dental health. Turns out, sugar-free diets and coarse-bred naturally clean teeth. Who knew? Childbirth was its own special horror show. Midwives had tricks like birthing stools and herbal painkillers. But if things went wrong, yikes. C-sections only happened post-mortem to baptize the baby before it died too. Maternal mortality was so high, many women wrote wills before going into labor. Cheery stuff. But here's the wild part. Some medieval cures actually worked. Sorta. Willow bark tea nature's aspirin really does reduce pain. Honey poultices have antibacterial properties. Even those weird astrological charts helped by creating treatment schedules that sometimes allowed proper healing time. They were working with 1% of our knowledge and still stumbled onto some effective treatments. Through sheer trial and error, medical training was inconsistent. Universities taught from ancient Greek texts nobody dared question. Dissection was often banned, so students learned anatomy from pigs because obviously human insides look like hog guts. The church blocked progress by calling anything new heresy. One guy figured out blood circulation 300 years early and got ignored because it contradicted church-approved science. Plague doctors get all the press, but regular medieval docs were just trying their best with what they had. Sure, their methods seem barbaric now, but in 500 years, people will probably say the same about our chemo and lobotomies. Perspective, right? Let's dive into medieval public health, or as I like to call it, how not to die in the 14th century. Spoiler alert, it wasn't easy. Cities back then were basically open air. Petri dishes where the streets doubled as sewers, and your neighbor's chamber pot contents might end up in your breakfast. Good times. First rule of medieval survival? Don't drink the water, seriously. Unless you wanted a front row ticket to Dysentery Town, you stuck to beer. Even kids drank the weak stuff. Water sources were contaminated with everything from tanners, chemicals to butcher's offal. Smarter towns built conduits from clean springs. But most folks relied on wells that were basically bacterial soup kitchens. Bathing was controversial. The church kind of frowned on it as vanity. So many people went months without proper washing. Wealthy folks had wooden tubs with linen sheets to avoid touching dirty water directly irony level. Medieval. Public bathhouses existed until the plague hit. Then everyone decided soaking naked with strangers might not be genius. Great unwashed era of perfume and linen undershirts to soak up sweat. Classy. Now let's talk toilets. Most homes had a chamber pot emptied into the street, shouting, "Gardy-loo." First medieval version of Heads Up. Fancier places had garderobes, basically wooden seats overhanging castle walls so your business could plop straight into the moat. Pro tip: don't be the moat cleaner. Some monasteries had proper drainage systems, but your average peasant just squatted behind the cabbage patch. Privacy was a luxury. Street cleaning was practically non-existent. Butchers dumped animal guts in alleys. Tanners used urine for leatherworking. The smell must have been apocalyptic, and everyone tossed their trash wherever. The few cities that tried sanitation laws usually gave up because, well, medieval people were stubborn. London did eventually ban dumping filth and entrails into the Thames, right by the water wheels that supplied drinking water. Progress. Pest control. What pest control? Rats and fleas had VIP status in medieval homes. Bed bugs were so common, people just accepted waking up covered in bites. The rich used fur covers on their beds, which surprise-housed extra fleas. Peasants slept on straw mattresses that were basically insect condos. Ever wonder why medieval? Art shows people vigorously scratching. It's mystery solved. Now for the fun part, medieval food safety. Meat was often half-rotten before salting or smoking. Cooks used insane spices not just for taste, but to cover the stench. That fresh fish at market probably sat in the sun for 3 days. Milk soured fast, so everyone drank it fermented as cheese or butter. Bread could contain everything from sawdust to ground bones as filler. Bon appetit. But wait, there's more. Want to know how they tested for bread fraud? Bakers who cheated customers got dragged through the streets on a hurdle wooden frame, or stuck in pillories where people could throw the bad bread at them. Some towns had ale tasters, official jobs where you got paid to drink test beer quality. Sign me up for that gig. Again, using the term loosely, were infection breeding grounds. Patients shared beds, straw mattresses were reused, until they disintegrated, and sterilization meant wiping tools on your apron. The smartest things some places did? Separate the sick from the healthy? Revolutionary concept, right? Here's the kicker. Despite all this, medieval folks weren't complete idiots about health. They knew to isolate plague victims even if they didn't know why it worked. Built latrines downstream from water sources sometimes. Used vinegar and herbs as basic disinfectants. Developed quarantine practices we still use today. The wealthy fled cities. Social distancing. Some doctors recommended fresh air and exercise. Shocking. People noticed cleaner towns had fewer deaths, even if they blamed it on bad air instead of bacteria. They were piecing together public health through observation and sheer desperation. Ironically, some medieval cures were more hygienic than 19th century medicine. Ever heard of maggot therapy? They'd put live maggots in wounds to eat dead tissue, something hospitals still do today. Honey poultices really do fight infection. Even their obsession with balancing humors led to decent practices like moderation in diet. The real tragedy: they had puzzle pieces of real science but lacked the framework to put them together. The Black Death hit. Some doctors noticed miasma theory didn't explain why isolated villages stayed healthy, but the church shut down anyone questioning divine punishment theories. Sound familiar? So next time you flush a toilet or wash your hands, take a moment to appreciate modern sanitation. Our ancestors were basically playing life on hard mode with none of the cheat codes. The fact any of them survived to pass on genes is nothing short of miraculous. That's off to you medieval peasants. You made it through literal shitstorms, so we could enjoy antibacterial soap and sewage systems. We salute you.
All right, let's talk about medieval medicine's greatest hits. The utterly bonkers cures that make you wonder how humanity survived this long. We're talking about an era where "let's see what happens" was basically the standard medical protocol, and the Hippocratic Oath was more like a gentle suggestion. First up, headache remedies. Got a migraine? Time for trepanation, the ancient art of drilling holes in skulls to release evil spirits. Archaeologists find tons of healed trepanned skulls, meaning somehow people survived this literal headache-inducing procedure. The alternative? A nice mercury enema, because nothing says cure like heavy metal poisoning. Broken bone. The standard treatment was 1. Set bone. 2. Wrap in linen soaked with egg whites, nature's cast. 3. Pray it heals straight. Surprisingly effective if you didn't get infected. But if the bone poked through skin, congrats, you're now an amputee candidate. Barber surgeons would saw it off with the same tools they used to trim beards, hygiene optional. Post-op care involved cauterizing with boiling oil because apparently pain builds character. Now for everyone's favorite, bloodletting. Medieval docs believed all illnesses stemmed from bad humors needing drainage. They'd bleed patients using leeches, the fancy option; dirty knives, the peasant special; cupping with heated glasses, creating horrific blisters for balance. The logic was flawless. If the patient died, clearly they were too far gone. If they lived, the treatment worked. Win-win. Some unlucky souls got bled monthly as preventative care, walking around chronically anemic but convinced it kept them healthy. Got a fever? Time for the cooling treatment, wrapping patients in ice-cold sheets until they shivered uncontrollably. Shockingly, this sometimes worked by breaking high fevers, when it didn't accidentally kill weakened patients. The alternative was sweating out the illness in herbal steam baths that probably felt amazing right before you passed out from heat stroke. Mental health treatments deserve their own horror movie. Depression? They dunk you in ice water to shock the sadness out. Schizophrenia? Chains and dungeon time. Hysteria, the catch-all for women being difficult, called for pelvic massages until paroxysms occurred. Yes, that kind. Some poor medieval housewife got prescribed orgasms as medical treatment. Tough gig. Now let's talk about the plague cures that were basically suicide with extra steps. Smearing onion/butter paste on boils, the medieval equivalent of essential oils. Strapping live chickens to swollen lymph nodes, because why not? Drinking molten gold, for wealthy idiots only. Self-flagellation to atone for sins, the church's go-to solution. The few actual helpful treatments survived by accident. Vinegar rinses, mildly antiseptic. Herbal teas, some had real pain-killing properties. Quarantine, genius once they noticed it worked. But mostly it was a carnival of horrors where the cure was often worse than the disease. Here's the wild part. Some of this nonsense persisted into the 1800s because medieval medical texts became untouchable gospel. Doctors would rather bleed a patient to death than question ancient Greek theories. The few who suggested new ideas got laughed at or worse. One pioneer suggested washing hands between deliveries after noticing it reduced childbed fever. His colleagues drove him to suicide for insulting their honor. Classy. Medical education was its own joke. Students would read 1,000-year-old texts in Latin they barely understood. Examine urine color charts, because P holds all life's answers. Debate how many angels could dance on a needlepoint, actual theological study. Maybe watch one dissection if they were lucky. Dissections when they happened were gruesome public spectacles. The body would rot before they finished because refrigeration wasn't a thing. Students fought over organs like dogs at a barbecue. And the professor would read from Galen's ancient texts while some poor barber did the actual cutting, proving the body didn't match the diagrams, but nobody dared say so. Surgery tools looked like something from a serial killer's toolbox. Bone saws with teeth like a shark's grin. Amputation knives the size of small swords. Bullet extractors resembling medieval torture devices. Needles big enough to stitch sails. Anesthesia options included getting blackout drunk, most popular. Biting a leather strap, masochist's choice. A good whack to the head, surprisingly common. Opium if you were rich and lucky. Survival rates? Let's just say you had better odds in a jousting match. The real MVPs were battlefield surgeons who could tie off arteries mid-battle while arrows whizzed past their heads. Those guys earned their pay in blood and screams. But here's the twist. Medieval medicine wasn't all quackery. Some innovations were brilliant. They invented the first prosthetic limbs, wooden pegs, and hook hands. Developed early cataract surgery techniques. Used spider silk for stitching wounds, still the strongest natural suture. created specialized tools for removing arrowheads. Herbalists compiled massive encyclopedias of plant properties through trial and error. Midwives passed down generations of birthing knowledge. Even the wacky astrological charts encouraged doctors to track patients' symptoms over time, an early form of medical records. The real tragedy was the knowledge lost when the church burned heretical texts or banned dissection. Arabic medical advances were often ignored because not Christian enough. Women healers got persecuted as witches for knowing too much. Progress moved at a snail's pace because challenging authority was dangerous. So next time you complain about hospital wait times, remember, at least nobody's suggesting we drill holes in your head for a headache. Modern medicine has its flaws, but compared to the medieval free-for-all, we're living in a golden age of not dying from a shave gone wrong. Silver linings, people. Me tell you about the time I watched a medieval surgeon at work. Picture this. It's market day in 14th century London, and old Tom the barber surgeon has set up his stall right next to the pig butcher. Not exactly what you'd call sterile conditions, but nobody seemed to mind the flies. I remember young William coming in, pale as death, clutching his arm where an arrow had gone clean through during yesterday's tavern brawl. Tom didn't even wash his hands, just took a swig of ale, wiped his knife on his apron, and got to work. "Bite down on this, lad," he says, shoving a leather strap between William's teeth. What followed were the most horrific screams I'd ever heard as Tom dug around in the wound with what looked like his wife's embroidery tweezers. The real showstopper came when Agnes, the midwife, wandered over with her basket of herbs. "You're doing it all wrong," she clucks and proceeds to dump what smelled like rotten eggs into the wound. Miraculously, the infection cleared up in a week, though whether it was Agnes' poultice or William's constitution, nobody could say. I'll never forget the day the plague doctor came to town, though. That eerie bird mask staring down at you while he poked your sores with a silver-tipped cane. Old Mother Higgins swore he cured her with his magic vinegar, but we all knew she'd just gotten lucky. 3 houses down, the Smiths' entire family had died after the same treatment. The funniest thing? For all their bloodletting and leeches, these folks somehow kept the town going. Old Tom might have been rough as guts, but he set more broken bones than I can count. Agnes delivered half the babies in the parish with nothing but rosemary oil and steady hands. Even that ridiculous plague doctor, for all his pomp, was the only one brave enough to tend the sick when the rest of us were hiding in our cellars. Strange to think now how they'd mix up potions by candlelight, arguing about whether the moon was in the right phase for surgery. We laughed at their superstitions, but they were piecing together the rules as they went along. Every cured patient, every survived childbirth, it all added up to something like progress, even if they didn't always understand why their remedies worked. Last I heard, young William became a surgeon himself after that arrow wound. Says he's developed a new technique using boiled thread for stitches. Maybe there's hope for us yet. As the Middle Ages waned, so too did many of its most extreme medical practices. The Renaissance brought renewed interest in scientific inquiry, gradually displacing centuries of reliance on ancient texts and superstition. Yet medieval medicine's legacy endures in unexpected ways, its failures and accidental successes both shaping modern healthcare. The plague doctor's costume, now an icon of macabre history, represents humanity's first tentative steps toward personal protective equipment. Those long waxed coats and beaked masks, though designed for the wrong purpose, established the principle of barrier protection between caregiver and patient. Today's hazmat suits and N95 masks descend conceptually from these medieval attempts at infection control. Medieval herbalists, often dismissed as wise women or witch doctors, compiled the first systematic records of plant-based medicines. Modern pharmacology still utilizes compounds first isolated from their traditional remedies, willow bark becoming aspirin, foxglove yielding digitalis. The clinical trials of tomorrow may yet validate more ancient remedies currently relegated to alternative medicine. The concept of quarantine, born from desperate observation during the Black Death, remains foundational to pandemic response. When 14th century Venetian officials mandated 40-day isolations for arriving ships, they established public health protocols that would eventually curb countless disease outbreaks. Their empirical approach, noticing what worked without understanding why, laid groundwork for modern epidemiology. Surgical practices evolved from the barber surgeon's brutal speed to today's meticulous precision, but the transition took centuries. Those horrifying amputation kits and unsterilized tools gradually gave way to proper anesthesia and antisepsis. Yet medieval surgeons developed techniques for arrow removal and wound closure that still inform battlefield medicine. Their prosthetic devices, crude peg legs and hook hands, were the ancestors of today's bionic limbs. Even the much-maligned humoral theory contributed to medicine's development. While the four humors, blood, phlegm, black bile, yellow bile, were pure fantasy, their emphasis on bodily balance anticipated modern understandings of homeostasis. The idea that health requires systemic equilibrium remains central to medical thinking, even if the specifics were entirely wrong. The greatest tragedy of medieval medicine wasn't its ignorance, but the suppression of observable truths by religious dogma. When physicians noticed contagion patterns during plague outbreaks or recognized the benefits of certain herbs, the Church often dismissed these observations as challenges to divine will. Progress stalled for centuries until the scientific method finally overcame theological obstruction. Today, we recognize medieval medicine as both cautionary tale and unexpected pioneer. Its failures teach the dangers of dogma, while its accidental successes hint at humanity's capacity to find solutions even without proper tools or understanding. The next time you visit a modern hospital, consider that its sterility protocols and evidence-based treatments descend from centuries of trial, error, and hard-won knowledge. As we face new medical challenges, antibiotic resistance, emerging viruses, neurological disorders, we would do well to remember both medieval medicine's perseverance and its pitfalls. The path to healing never runs straight, but each generation builds upon the last, whether through brilliant discovery or bloody trial. From plague masks to gene therapy, the journey continues.